So thank you very much. I actually heard a lot of this conversation about what is a good life is critical to everything we do, right? Because if we don't understand what we're trying to achieve, it is very hard to execute in ways that actually achieve the thing that we're trying to achieve. So I heard that through your perspectives, what you think your kids or the youth that are in the room and the people with the lived experience that are in the room, I heard a few themes that kind of, to me, make sense to group together. So I'm hearing a lot about autonomy, ability to get to a place where you have the right to make decisions, you get to make decisions, and you get to live the life you want to live. I'm hearing about something about social connectedness, and I'm hearing about good physical and mental health access. So you called it access, but I would say it's not just access. It is healthcare and mental health, because you could have access and we may not know what to do, right? And then the fact that you have access is not particularly helpful because we don't know how to help you, right? So it is about good mental and health. And then I heard some things about the things that we all want in adult life, ability to have housing and food security and potential for leisure, but are universal goods. And sometimes we start medicalizing the needs of our neurodivergent people, but they really want things that everybody wants for adult life. The priorities, I'm totally hearing, and it's been a few years, right? So the priorities came out in 2018. So the idea that the intervention level is not just at the person or at the family and immediate circle, but there are societal interventions, is something that did not come up originally in the prioritization process, but it's because probably times are shifting about how we're thinking about things. For those of you who were not involved, to remind everybody, the way this happened is a survey was sent out to the whole province, multiple organizations, north, south, rural, urban. We got open-ended questions. We had a committee made by some of you and by some researchers where we grouped them, the open text into 100. We got down from 1,000 to 100 questions. Then we sent it out across the province, asked people to pick their top 10, and we got to 30. And then from the 30, we actually had an in-person thing where you guys fought it out, some of you, but across the province, not just Pond, like people from across the province, families and caregivers, and gave us a top 10. So if it's not in the top 10, it doesn't matter, it doesn't mean it was not there. It means that when people had to say, this is where I want you to put the money for the next whatever years, this was where they came up with. Because I heard education, and I can tell you education was number 11. And we have kept the top 30, like the top 30 for us is sacred, but putting up the top 10 obviously makes sense. The other thing is, somebody said early diagnosis, and we had made a very conscious decision during that exercise that we're not going to pin diagnosis against therapy. Of course, we need both therapy and diagnosis. So we had focused we have a list of items that were not related to diagnosis, that we kept them as a separate document, and we did not make them part of the prioritization. We don't want parents to have to, or the youth have to pick between getting diagnosed and getting appropriate intervention. We have to consider them automatic parallel goods, right? So that's why you don't see anything related to detection, diagnosis, biological markers on that list. They did come, but we didn't pin them against each other. So lots of thinking for us to do. I think all the answers have been cataloged, and our youth and our patient advisory will revisit them and have conversations. And remember, you can always join the youth advisory, but there will be other opportunities for you to also contribute, even if you don't join the youth and the PAC advisory. So I want to tell you a little bit about what we're doing in the next few years, and where there is lots of room still for discussion about what we're going to do. So let's have a little bit of it today in the next 15 to 20 minutes, and then talk about how we're going to have further engagement. So first of all, we got renewed. We got renewed based on the performance of the of the previous 10 years, and they basically like the structure of Pond, and they want us to keep with the structure of Pond. So this idea that we're collecting data across different platforms, across different modalities, and trying to figure out which pieces of information speak more to the individualized needs of kids is what they want us to continue on. So our funding is based on that. There are some changes we're making because we're learning and because we want to add some things for the same budget. So our budget stays level, which is actually kind of an accomplishment, I have to tell you. Anyway, I'm not going to get into that unless you have a question. So we're maintaining our funding. So if we're going to do anything new, we have to cut it from somewhere else. We also need to strategically think about where we may have more opportunity to get external funds to supplement things, and where we need to keep the OBI money to keep the basic business of Pond running. And so we're keeping all our platforms, but we're expanding a little bit the types of data that we collect, not just on the behavior side, but on the types of tissues for the questions you had before. So we are collecting now saliva and blood and urine and stool, we'll ask you. And I know not everybody's going to do it, but you're going to go home on your next visit with a little cup that you collect stool to bring it back to start looking at the bugs in the gut and the bugs in the saliva and the bugs in the urine to see how they're interacting with our brains and our genes to figure out, to kind of change our strengths and our weaknesses, our challenges and resilience. Yes?
Will the endocannabinoid system be looked at?
So this is a research question, which is a good segue to what I'm going to say next. Yeah. So you'll see this yellow box that says omics. So basically what we're going to do in order to be able to do all of that and a few other things that I'm going to tell you in a second is we're going to collect the samples and we're going to bank them properly at Dr. Scher's here biobank. And then we're going to ask researchers to come in with their questions, and there could be somebody that asks a question on the endocannabinoid system, or a variety of other systems, to come in with their money to access the sample. So we're partnering with them. We are making it easier for them to get money by saying, we have the patients, we have the samples. You can write now a grant to just get the analytic part funded, to ask many more questions. It's a slightly different model. I mean, we were kind of doing most of it before too, because for every $2 we get from OBI, we've been able to bring $1 external to OBI. But now we're structuring a bit more that we're going to keep our genomics as is, we're keeping our imaging as is, but then we're just collecting samples. We have some good questions for those samples. Some of them we'll take internally to answer the questions, but we're going to open up also the samples to our collaborators to come in and ask very specific questions. So that's how we're thinking. Immune, hormones, certain systems of interest will get specifically probed. We'll just have all the right samples for them to be able to do it. So that's one change. The other change is we're going to add a couple of biomarkers to measure things that you have told us are important. So those of you who participated in the clinical trial, you know we had that sensory device that allowed us to look at the sensory thresholds and sensory processing. We're going to add it now for everybody, all kids, no matter what their diagnosis across all sites. We're going to start more specifically looking at sensory processing. We're also going to look at sleep. Kids are going to get special actigraphy watches to wear for a week when they go to sleep, for us to start getting naturalistic sleep data, because you told us that sleep is disturbed and you are wondering whether sleep actually feeds into other types of difficulties that kids have. And third, remember the anxiety meter / Holly that Azadeh presented? We're going to now send home everybody with a Samsung watch to collect some of these data to understand how that data can be used in real life to actually improve kids' emotional regulation. So these are some of the basic changes to the main core. There is a couple of other things we can do with very little money, but we're trying to figure out how to do things like measuring the gait of the kids when they come in, because we think there's something about gait that can give us potentially an idea of what subgroup you may belong to. I know it sounds weird, but it may be true, so that's why we're going to test it out. And then there's a couple of other things that we want to do, but we don't have money to do. So one is EEG, and the other one is eye tracking. And so we're going to keep those for now on a pilot basis, so for small groups of kids, and hopefully we'll get the money in the next couple of years to spread them out to everybody. So this is our basic biomarker thing. The other thing, and it was already alluded to by Danielle, I think, is a third of our cohort now. So the mean age of the kids when they came into Pond was about 11. And the range was, I think, 18 months to 21 years. But we've been active for 10 years, so what do you think happened? They've grown. So we actually have a third of the cohort right now that are young adults. So we have a protocol to actually look at adult outcomes, young adult outcomes of the kids, irrespectively of what diagnosis they have. And then we're going to use all this information that we have collected over the years to predict what predicts a better outcome, what predicts kids who didn't do very well, and where there is opportunity for intervention, right? Because now we have longitudinal data. When you get called for a longitudinal time point, a third of our kids are going to actually be adults. So we can ask those questions. So that's another addition. We keep linking to ICES. You heard from Danielle to kind of understand how to best use that system. So there will be some of that work. And we have also partnered more with our European partners to explore some of the things that I already talked about. And then clinical trials. So I showed you guys that we started clustering brains to understand groups of kids who have more similar brains. What's the next step? We need to understand if these groups of kids who now have more similar brains are more likely to respond to treatments that target that biology, right? Irrespectively of their diagnosis. So if we drop the diagnostic labels and we know these kids belong in cluster A and that cluster is likely to have that biology, then we can start doing intervention studies that target that biology or that profile if it's not a medication treatment. You may ask me, how do I know what the biology is? Anybody curious? So yeah, this is a hard question, but it's part of the innovation of the protocol. So this is partly why we did the animal model data. So we have now clusters of kids who have patterns of brain anatomy that we can map to the brain anatomy differences we saw in the mouse. And remember, in the mouse, we knew exactly what the biology was because we created it in the mice. We introduced biology, a difference that is similar to neurodevelopmental difference. So we have finished an exercise where we have mapped clusters from mouse to human. We think we have at least 2 clusters of kids who have brains where we can predict the biology to some degree. It's the experiment, right? So some of you are going to get calls and letters in the next 6 months that say something like, based on your child's, or if you're already a youth, based on your brain biology, we think we may have a treatment that's a better match for your individual biology, and we are running a clinical trial. Would you be interested? This is what that would be about. And it would be testing this idea that even if we don't know your genetics, by using your brain, we may be better tailored to be able to think about which treatment may be a good match for you. It's not going to be all of you, it's going to be some of you, because some areas we have confidence right now, and some they look really messy, and so we're not touching them yet, as the computational people do the cross-species computational work. There is also an effort to find kids that are predicted to have a certain biology. So for example, there are certain drugs available that we know are good targets for certain biology. So if we find kids in those clusters, if we find any clusters that are good match for available drugs, we may prioritize them just because they're available. And we can do things earlier. So that's one. Second one, we're making a commitment, more of a commitment, because now we know better, a little bit better, in the rare disorder space. So sorry, Karen, it has taken forever, but finally the antioxidant compound that Jim Eubanks tested in the mouse model, we have manufactured appropriately Health Canada. We're waiting the final paperwork from the company. So we will run the red trial with the antioxidant group, but we also have a series of protocols in the works with other partners for other rare genetic conditions. So a little bit on Fragile X, Prader-Willi, Kabuki syndrome, and so on. So this can be a partnership, right? So we don't have preconceived ideas about which disorders to prioritize. We are looking for partners who may have an idea or a group that we may starting to know enough that we can make an educated decision about what medication may be a good match. Some of them we do them on our own, some of them we do them in partnership with advocacy organizations, and some of them we do them in partnership with industry. So you are welcome to bring to us ideas about what rare genetic groups would be priority for you, for us to start thinking about these rare disorder trials. And the other thing that you didn't hear from Dr. Daniel Baribos, he told you about her linkage to the ICS, but the other part of her portfolio is doing the extra ultra rare in terms of interventions, and she's developing novel methodology around the ultra rare. So for kids who, there may be 10 around the world or 15 around the world, there is some methodology development that's happening of how to test compounds and have some confidence that they're actually working. And again, I can answer questions if there are questions. We have worked with pharma before. So some of the work that we do on our own. Some of them we do it in partnership, but we are the boss. But there is also some investment in the field that's of relevance to you in terms of international trials. They're just not coming to Canada. So we've been spending the last year and a half developing those relationships to make sure that when an international study runs, they think of us as one of the networks they come to. And one way that we have done this, so one has been in kind of personal relationship building, but the other way we've been doing this is by thinking how we can take POND out of Ontario, the clinical trials piece, and make it national. So the last thing that I'm going to mention on the clinical trial front is we finally got a match from the Azrieli Foundation to our POND and some CHR funding we had on clinical trials to launch a Canadian clinical trials network dedicated to neurodevelopmental disorders. So this is now going to be national. POND sites will be part of it, but it's not going to be only Ontario. It includes sites in Nova Scotia, in Quebec, in Alberta, right now active, and then to be brought on with the next step are BC, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, New Brunswick, and Newfoundland. Okay? So the first trial, so the scope of this network then would be to focus on clinical trials for kids who have a variety of neurodevelopmental conditions, both common and rare. It doesn't really matter what it is. Some will be supported through POND funds, some sites, and some sites will get supported through our partners. The first trial we're going to run, because we were talking about anxiety before, is a sertraline study, a study that targets anxiety with a common anti-anxiety drug that has never been tested, to Danielle's point, in neurodevelopmental conditions. And we're going to test a novel design that we took from oncology called the basket trial. So typically what we do is we take one condition, one target, one medicine, and we do one thing at a time. We're going to test a novel design that allows us to take multiple conditions that have a symptom shared, prioritized by the patient's symptom that they want treatment for. We're going to run the trial with all the kids together, but they're not just mixed up, I promise. So that's why it's called the basket trial. So every condition becomes a basket. So the condition belongs in the basket. And then we have partnered with a very, very, very smart a statistician from CKIDS who does Bayesian statistics. We can talk about Bayesian statistics later on if you like. And she's going to be looking without us knowing in the back end to see whether certain baskets behave the same way, so certain conditions behave the same way. Therefore, we don't need independent trials for them. They can get collapsed into one basket, and we will have power with a small number of kids to make definitive decisions. So for example, in this case, we have picked anxieties. We have 3 common conditions. We have ADHD, ASD, and tic disorders. And then we have picked 3 rare conditions that have anxiety as a common phenotype. So Fragile X, tuberous sclerosis, and 22q11 deletions. All these kids are going to come into trials. It's going to be monitoring the back. Let's say if, I don't know, ADHD and tic disorders behave the same. And if it starts looking like they're behaving the same, we're not going to wait until we get the full sample for both, because if they're behaving the same, we can combine them. And it will be particularly interesting for the rare disorders, because for the rare disorders, we never have enough of a sample. So if one of the rare disorders starts looking like it's behaving like one of the common disorders, then we can collapse them and actually have power to say something about the rare disorder, right? So we're going to test these like innovative models of running clinical trials. It gives us also the opportunity to run transdiagnostic studies, which we have talked about forever but couldn't figure out how to do it. And we will do it nationally for the first time, so POND Plus, to start developing the momentum for innovative studies in this space. But at the same time, Danielle is running right now an N of 1 trial for a very extra, so this is taking all of them together. The opposite would be taking a kid at a time, or 2 kids at a time. And she has started already developing the methods and already runs ultra rare disorder where we can only do 1 kid at a time, right? So it gives us just opportunities to think through how we're going to come up with answers for many different disorders, for the amount of resources that are required to actually run a clinical trial. And because kids are different, and we have already established heterogeneity is a thing, we're not just going to collapse them all together. We're going to look at your autonomic nervous system activity in this study using Azadeh's ANS watch to see if that predicts who's responding to sertraline or who's not. We're going to look at pharmacogenetics to see if there are aspects of your genome that predict treatment response to a particular medication. And we're going to look at serotonin levels to see whether there is another blood marker that predicts treatment response to that particular medication for anxiety. Yes? How do we measure what? How do we measure it? I mean, we collect blood, and we have a partner at Columbia in New York, where we're going to send all our samples. He's going to send us back a spreadsheet. That's how we do it. Okay, so that's like my clinical trial thing. So basically, the basket trial is done. Is going to be done. The clinical trials network has been unofficially launched. Like, we officially can speak about it now. We had our first meeting in the network. Within the next 3 to 4 months, you're going to hear a bigger announcement when we are ready to have a website and terms of reference and all of that. So you're going to hear more about all the potential individual different designs we can do, but we couldn't do just with the Ontario sites. We want partnership for the rare disorder space, so bring us whatever you want. And we have a process to work through and think through what's ready and what's not ready for kind of a rare disorder intervention. And then we will attempt our most novel thing within the next year, which is taking one of the brain clusters and actually treating based on the brain cluster and not based on the diagnostic label for clinical trials. Okay. Then patient community partnerships, and you guys are, I mean, you're critical to everything up to here, but this is the most critical. So we also have an education mandate, which has not been very well articulated up to now, because basically we don't have money for an education mandate. So what we are doing usually is we're using every other pocket of money we have or every other activity we have and trying to link it in, but now we formalized it. So we have 2 educational big buckets of deliverables. One is to educate clinicians, and the other one is to educate trainees to come into the field. So there are several ECHOs. We have talked about ECHOs before. These are the capacity building, web-based systems that have been funded by the Ministry of Health to build capacity in the community. We ran a couple of them between all of us in neurodevelopmental conditions, and then we have partnered with a couple that are not in neurodevelopmental conditions, but they should know about us because our kids have those kinds of problems. For example, I'm giving a talk, I think, next week in the pediatric obesity echo, because they never think about what it means to be neurodivergent and obese when they develop plans for obesity in kids, for example. So we're going to use the echo structure to educate on what we are learning from POND and to actually provide expertise. And then we partnered with 3 large federal training grants. One is Enrich, which is the National Federal Training Grant for pediatricians, but for anything related to pediatric health. So it's not pediatricians, it could be clinicians or non-clinicians who work on pediatric health. The second one is Impact. It's a new training grant for clinical trials in pediatrics. So we have already an MOU in place. And the third one is CANARD, which is the Neurodevelopmental Disorders Training Grant funded by the Israeli Foundation. So 2 federal and 1 from philanthropy to actually bring the trainees into the network or have our trainees be of their networks so that we can disseminate the knowledge that's coming out of POND and bring knowledge in. On the implementation in health systems, this is going to be the hardest one. So we've had this conversation before, but now we need to structure it. So if we say that just having an autism label or just having an ADHD label should not put you on a path that's like predetermined for you based on your diagnosis, then what's the alternative? And what is the system willing to take? And who are the partners that we need to co-design with? So you're going to hear from us, probably not in the next few months, but a little bit after that, in an effort to develop a steering group that will involve parents, youth, people with lived experience, policymakers, government people, and service providers to say, if not this, then what, right? Because we can't just destroy what we have and not replace it with something. We need to replace it with something that's going to do better, not with something that's just going to replace one label with another label, right? That doesn't work. So there's going to be quite a bit of that. We do need to get funding for this work, but it's not provided from OBI right now. So that's why I'm saying it's not going to be the next 6 months, but hopefully within the year, you will get invitations to be part of a steering group. And then we're spending a lot of more effort this time around on issues of equity, and I saw it come up, and representation. So 3 things. First of all, if you are asking me what our representation looks currently in the POND network, I'll tell you what we're close to census. So we're getting kind of the representation that we have in our communities. But if you look at our PAC or our youth PAC, you realize that there is not representation. So basically what happens is we have people from structurally disadvantaged groups coming as participants, but we don't have people from structurally disadvantaged group telling us what their voices are and actually influencing the way we're going. So we're going to do a few things for this. The first thing is we have committed to a national survey spearheaded by POND to ask people of where they find value in research, and we're going to ask them a lot of information about their backgrounds. And then we're going to look to see how social determinants of health, marginalization status, socioeconomic things predict where you find value. And the reason we're doing this is not out of curiosity, but it is that we want to provide the value, so we bring people's voices in, right? So we want to know where the different groups actually find value and make sure that we build the value, right? The second thing we're going to do is so we have been excluding up to now kids who don't speak, families who cannot do all the assessments in English. We are mapping out the 10 top languages, the 10 top languages where we need translators in our hospitals. And we're mapping out all our measures to see how much we can actually do in other languages so that we don't exclude families who don't speak English. It's an experiment, so we're going to do it thoughtfully. We're going to actually create the translations, bring the interpreters, and then look to see if that affects the quality of our data. Usually people are like, don't do that, it brings a lot of noise, and then you cannot find the thing that's there. But the truth is nobody has shown that. There is no evidence to show that if you use translations and translated instruments, you increase the noise in your data. So we're going to actually experiment with it. We're going to do it, and then we're going to look at our data, monitor it, come back to you, and we can have these discussions, right? If it doesn't, obviously we're learning something about our biases. And if it does, we still have a discussion. There's a discussion to be had about where we're going to strike that balance between equity and still being able to do good science. The third thing we're doing is we're partnering, and I think Azadeh has left, but we are partnering with our computational people to find biases in our data. And that's a much bigger conversation. We'll have it at another time. Then remember the digital stories? Who remembers the digital stories that our youth did for mental health? Lots of people. Right. So we have now the mental health digital stories. We have partnered with University of Toronto Center for Interprofessional Education, and we're developing curriculum for the University of Toronto for allied health trainees that will use the digital stories as part of their curriculum for training to neurodevelopment and mental health. And then, I forgot, I have visuals that I ignored. It's like the visuals are only useful when you actually pay attention to them, right? I forgot to tell you that the study of the national survey, we're bringing back Dr. Christy Doyle-Thomas. I don't know how many of you remember her, but she was a postdoctoral fellow in Pond when we first started. Then she became research manager in Pond, and now she's faculty at Mohawk, and she's coming back to lead this project. And then the last project that we have is we are engaging in a First Nations engagement nationally to develop research priorities the way we did for white people before. And Grant Bruno, who's an Indigenous researcher out in Alberta, will lead that effort. I put some other partnerships at the bottom to show you that some of them involve rare disorder foundations, where they're coming to us for a variety of things. So Kabuki Syndrome Foundation came to us, not for a trial yet, because they're not ready for that, but they want us to actually test a bunch of biomarkers and do a little bit of a natural history work to help them out. So we are partnering with them to include the Kabuki Syndrome kids into our Pond cohort, but also do some extra work with some extra funds they have to actually understand how these rare disorder kids fit into the whole neurodevelopmental story. The other one I put there is the NIH GEARS grant, which is a grant that's and I'll get right then to you. That is a grant that's helping us. You may have noticed that we don't have a lot of environmental factors in our network. We do collect them, but we haven't done the work because, believe it or not, 4,000 kids is a very small sample to do gene by environment interaction work. And so we are committed to understanding that, but at this stage, the best way to do it is through partnership. So there is now a large NIH grant that puts together, it's a network of networks, right? We are collaborating with other networks to collect a little bit of extra environmental exposure data to start thinking through gene by environment interactions, for example. So I'm giving you those as examples of potential partnerships to say you can bring partnerships, right? And where we're gonna really, really, really need you is in the selection of the new clinical trials to be done. We're gonna need a steering group of parents to think through the EDI considerations, the equity and diversity considerations, as we go through the different projects. We will need a steering group of parents to help us with the health system stuff and policy stuff of, if not this, then what? And then we need you to bring the community expertise of where the need is that Pond actually can contribute to. So we're totally open for you to come and say, what you talked about was kind of cool, and I think the right fit for this is, or the right place to go with this is, right? I can never promise you, but we will be able to execute on the full list that you bring us. But I can promise you that we're gonna look together to see what are the criteria for us to be able to take something on that we can actually execute? We don't want to take things on that we're going to do a bad job on because we're not the right people, we don't have the right data, it's not ready yet. But I can tell you, we'll be very transparent about how we choose these partnerships, by what criteria, and we can decide together depending on the level you want to be involved. So I'm going to stop here. I think that was my last one, except for my thank yous, and see what people's reflections are, our first set of questions, because I know we're already like 15 minutes late.
So I just had a question regarding our son's an adult now, but we've been coming here for 20 years, and just wondering if adults will be able to participate in these studies and trials that you're talking about.
Yeah, so has your son been part of POND? Mm-hmm. So as long as he has been part of POND, mm-hmm. he can be part of the longitudinal cohort.
Oh, good.
And in the longitudinal cohort, we don't care about age. Perfect. We keep following people. And in fact, we know that a third of our samples is adults. And so we're specifically going to ask you to come back to do the adult protocol to see what we can predict early on for adulthood.
Excellent. Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Thoughts, questions? Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about, obviously a big part of POND going forward from what you're saying is the collection of data, right? And are you looking at kind of a bigger picture and saying, well, are we collecting the right data? Like I noticed you said you're going to change some biomarkers, something like that. Is there any like kind of bigger picture thought into what data going forward you're going to collect?
Yeah, so lots of time spent on this. As you can imagine, we don't want to waste your time and we don't want to waste our time or our money because we don't have enough money. It sounds like a lot. I don't think I've told people how much, but we got 2.6 million a year, right, Alana? Yeah. So it sounds like a lot, but by the time you divide it with all the activities, it's actually not a lot. In fact, it requires quite a bit of a match for us. So we spend a lot of time. First of all, we have partnered networks. So we have, as you may have heard, we have had networks in Europe that we have already collaborated, and there's a couple of networks in the US we're collaborating. And so if certain things get taken by somebody else and adequately answered, we don't need to do it all the time, right? So certain things we can drop. And then sometimes we have to pick them up just because they're doing them. So for example, the reason we want to pick EEG and eye tracking, although we don't have the money now, is because both the Europeans and the Americans went to the FDA and to the European medicine agencies and have submitted biomarkers from EEG and eye tracking that they claim that they are autistic biomarkers for autism. But nobody has looked whether they are present in other neurodevelopmental conditions. All they know is that it's different from typically developing kids. So we want to be able to find out, are these biomarkers for autism or are they biomarkers for any neurodevelopmental difference? And so sometimes we'll pick them up, although we're not particularly interested in the original biology, to contribute to the meaningfulness of things that are going to get approved for families because we have the right cohort. Then some things come up because people are telling us we're not measuring them well. So sleep was one. So we have a questionnaire, and people were like, this questionnaire is useless, right? Like, what are you doing with this questionnaire? It doesn't actually get into the kinds of problems we have with sleep. So we're like, okay, we're going to put actually actigraphy back in and measure sleep while the kids are sleeping at home, right? So that we can do it better. Or the sensory issues thing, right? It has come up a couple of times. We have a sensory questionnaire, but it does not seem to be doing the job. We've been evaluating how it does the job. It does not seem to be doing the job as well as we need it to be done. So now we're going to do a sensory biomarker, right? So that conversation happens all the time. We've had a harder conversation, and Jen can speak to it, about what measures to drop. And the reason it gets a bit complicated is not because we don't think that certain measures could be dropped. It's because it's longitudinal collection now. So we want to make sure that we don't lose the ability to look at trajectories of certain things, because sometimes one time point is not as useful as having the 3 time points over 6 years, let's say, right? So this is a bit harder. We're working through it. We're dropping some, we're adding some, and as we go, this is going to be iterative. And also, to be completely honest, as we're looking through the multiple languages issue and the representation issue, we may decide to drop some stuff just because they only exist in English and they have only been normed in white boys, which you would be surprised how many there are out there that are like that. So we may make some decisions based on how not representative they are of the population that actually comes into the study when they were originally developed. So a lot of this conversation, it's active. If anybody has an interest to be on those conversations, you can also let us know. Happy to have you on those conversations.
A quick question. It's really interesting to hear that of all of the contributions you've had from families and the kids, that quite a few of them are now adults. Just wanted to check, when we became part of this, we went through Shadok McMaster in the early 90s, 1990s. Yeah. Did that information make its way into the pond?
Well, did you sign consent form for pond? Do you
That's
remember?
a very good question. I honestly don't know.
So why don't you just shoot me an email and I'll figure it out for you. If you had signed consent for pond, we got you. It doesn't matter if you are at the beginning. And you can get called back for longitudinal visits. I mean, COVID was a bit tricky for people, and I would say McMaster had the hardest time because they got kicked out of their building. And so while some of us were bringing people back for longitudinal visits, I don't think anybody got called back during the 2.5 years from McMaster just because they had no access to their building. But if you let me know, then I'll figure out if you're in the cohort and you should be receiving information about longitudinal time points. If you were not part of pond, it depends on the age of the person.
Okay, they're now in their mid-30s. So
Mid-30s.
I'll follow up with you.
Follow up with me.
Right
The one
after
thing,
this.
because somebody else also asked me about their 40-year-old son, the one thing that we haven't talked about is leverage grants, because clearly we're over time, but we did manage to get a leverage grant to study aging that starts at 40. It's not funded by OBI, it's funded by CHR. So if people have made it to 40, then we can pick them up again. We have a gap in between. So just email me and we'll figure it out. Yeah. Any other last minute thoughts, questions?
Not a question, just a comment. We have a website called the Pond Network, so you can also see if you're from a different city. So like Hamilton, you can go on, and the coordinators there, you can also email them if you have any questions. You can see what's available, and my name's on there and Evdokia, so that you can see everybody as well as their emails if you weren't able to write.
Yeah, our contact information is there. You can just find us on the Pond website.
Would that be Carolyn Russell?
That's right. Yeah.
Okay,
So
great.
if you get in touch with Carolyn, she can let you know, and then see if you can eligible for more studies or come back or whatnot.
Great, thanks very much.
Okay, so then before you go, I'm going to bring up one more thing. Again, for interest purposes, and we're going to send an email out to see, but the PAC and the Youth PAC and us have been talking a bit about almost like a campaign. This is not about pond. This is about a savvy, educated community that has invested in this type of research, from genetics to neuroimaging to clinical trials, to talk about the value of research in this space and the value of the specific platforms of research. And we want to do that because somebody already mentioned, but there is quite a bit of misinformation out there. And we cannot fix the misinformation, but we can at least put out some information in common spaces that is approved by our participants, the youth, the families, who speak about the different types of platforms we have and their value. And we can put this in the public domain as part of a campaign. So it would not be like advertising pond. It would be about, why did I do genetics? Why did I do neuroimaging? Why am I participating in a clinical trial? The kinds of values that you may find. If you're interested in participating in an exercise like that, let us know. We're going to send an email out anyway, because we'll probably do something with our youth PAC and our PAC within the next year to start this rolling. But other than that, to Alan's point, all our contact information is on the website. feel free to email us, touch base with us. If you email me and I haven't answered, it's because it's an unopened email among my 5,000 unopened emails right now. So if it's important, please email me again, and CC Alana if possible, so that it doesn't get lost. It will never be because I don't want to answer. It will be because it's sitting in some black rabbit hole that I cannot get to. So just go back at me, and I will get back to you. Lovely to see you all. It was wonderful to have you here today. Here's to another 5 years together. Have a safe trip home.